Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I have with me my colleague Shambhavi Naik, and we're going to be talking about something that potentially can revolutionize and change how research is carried out, and not just carried out, but also disseminated, and that can have tremendous downstream effects around the world. But this is happening in the United States. So we're going to be talking about this new shift in US policy with regard to open source research and open source access of research. And we'll try and think of what are the implications of that for India and the world at large, and also journals and researchers and the rest of it. So Shambhavi, welcome to this conversation.
Hey Manoj, hey everybody. It is nice to be back on ATP after a long time.
And before I go forward, I have to acknowledge that this is a special episode of All Things Policy because this is our 900th episode. And when we sort of discussed this internally, that this is the 900th episode, we got some really curious facts about the number 900 in terms of ideas from people. One of them apparently being that Noah was 900 years old when he built the Ark. Apparently, I had no idea that was the case, but there were lots of interesting numbers around 900. So if you have some interesting fun 900 related, tidbits, please to share them with us. But that said, Shambhavi, let's first get to the sort of meat of the matter. So from what I understand, the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy announced that it will be making the results of taxpayer-supported research immediately available to the American public at no cost. So that's the shift. And this is going to be implemented across the board from 2025, although incrementally it will begin from immediately, right? From what I understand.
Yeah, it is to start now, and the process should have finished by the end of May.
Okay. So I'm curious why this decision was made to make this shift, because, why all of a sudden we see this change. And if I understand that there is something the European Union has also done, which is quite similar, right? So could you just talk us through a little bit about why this decision is being taken?
Yeah. So in the spirit of Noah and sharing resources and saving resources, I guess, let's talk about open science. So it is not a very sudden move. The US has been slowly shifting towards open access since 2008. First, it was the NIH, which is major funder for biomedical research, which told its scientists that for everything that it funds, their studies have to go into a public repository within the years of publication. Then in 2015, the then President Barack Obama extended those requirements to more agencies. And I think totally they meant that about 8 million scholarly publications became free to read within a year of publication. And they were being read by about 3 million people per day. This is stats that I'm reading out of a Nature article, the link to which you can find below in our description. So the idea that science has to be open has been around for a long time, especially publicly funded science, because the public is already spending money to create the science. Then they also have to spend money to get the science published. And then finally, they have to pay money to read that science. And so that kind of seemed to be duping public because we are paying over and over again to get access to something that we are already contributed to generating. There have been a lot of positive externalities which are associated with open science. The idea that information should not be stored or hoarded. Obviously, we saw this a lot during COVID, right? Because everyone was arguing that mRNA vaccines, the underlying technology had been created using public funds. So the technology should be allowed to be viewed by everybody and to be used by everybody. It's not like only one person had contributed and given the funds to create the technology. So the idea is that if knowledge is available fast, available quickly, then it is easier to build on it. And obviously it ends up educating everybody as well. So there should not be barriers to knowledge, particularly when it is public funded. What the latest advisory does is that it removes that grace period of a year. It says that the minute you publish something, it is peer reviewed, it has to go into a repository. So there have been follow-on advisories which have come from the White House, which basically say that, look, what we want is all funding agencies or institutions should have their own repository where the published paper has to be deposited for public viewing. Right? So they are not actually saying that you have to publish in an open access journal. They are just saying that we basically want all data to be available to the public through institutional repositories. Now, if you think about the publishing process as well, and why this has actually happened, why we have so many journals, why are people paying over and over again for publishing, for creating the knowledge, and then for reading? So what is the value of the journal? The value of the journal has been peer review. And more than contributing to the science itself, it is also contributed to the scientist. So what I mean by that is that the way scientists get judged when they want to move, when they want to be promoted, is that you have to present your academic presentation, publications, right? And what journals operate on is this idea of impact factor. So how rigorous is their peer review process? How well are the other papers that are being published in that journal, right? So as a scientist, I would get judged on how many publications I have, not necessarily how many people have read those publications, but the impact factor of the journal in which I had published, right? And so slowly over time, that incentive has moved from making the science available to everybody to, but the incentive for the scientist has moved from making the science available to everybody to making sure that I get published in a reputed journal so that my next grant or my next promotion or the next job I move to is secure, right? So somewhere journals seem to have kind of stopped being, or rather in addition to being a disseminator of science, they have become bar for scientists and their growth, right? So that message has got lost somewhere, that we want more science.
But despite it, regardless of that, and we'll discuss more about the sort of the economics and the business model that this is, and how there are challenges obviously with the model. But from the point of sort of philosophically, if we step back, why should the government have any say in this? Aren't you disincentivizing more research because you are making, there's a slippery slope argument here, right? The fact that today you've made a case saying public funds, it depends on how do you define what is public funds, right? The next thing the argument could be made that, well, public land available at concessional costs for a research center is public funds. And that could lead to saying that, okay, then that research must be available open access. What does that do then? Where is the market failure necessarily? I think partly you've answered that there is a market failure in terms of the fact that, the model has shifted the way you've described it. But also, it could end up actually creating the slippery slope, which is that, at the end of the day, everybody has some degree of taxpayer support that is going on in one way or the other. It depends on then how you would define public funds, what is the criteria that you would use. Otherwise, you may end up disincentivizing most research, right? Because if people don't have access to eventually either their career growth or journals from a revenue point of view, and then you may see standards dip.
Right. So I think that's the very interesting conundrum about publications. I think knowledge is non-rivalrous in a nature where a lot of the other public assets are rivalrous, right? So obviously the more you spread, you just want to keep on increasing its value, because the more people read it, the more people might get inspired to do something to build on it, etc. The conundrum that has been created by the fact that as institutions, we also then associate a particular journal with a particular impact factor, and the fact that we believe that is a good criteria for scientists to be judged on. That could be another podcast episode, I think. So how we shift from that philosophy. A lot of funding agencies have been trying to move. In fact, DBT-DST, which is the Department of Biotechnology and Department of Science and Technology of the Government of India, had put out a paper in 2015 or late 2014, where they said that, hey, look, we don't think the scientists at DBT and DST are hiring should be judged on their impact factors or the papers that they produce, which is all very nice to say, but we really haven't brainstormed on another tangible criteria that could be used in place of impact factors. And as far as I know, people still will look at impact factors. There have been progressive hirings that a lot of senior scientists will talk about. They will say, no, we don't look at it, but it's still usually the first check that goes on. So when you send in an application, I think they probably just grade you based on the publications, and then eventually other criteria will also come in. So I think the point on that is that doing open access, doing open science, I think is great for society, but it puts all of the burden onto, say, the institutions which has to now create the open repository, right? And we haven't thought about the consequence on scientists and how do we deal with those.
Yeah, because when I read through the statement that was put out by the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy, they say something to the effect of that we need to do this to level the playing field for all American innovators, which will help make America again this world leader in science and technology. And the idea is that, look, journals, taxpayer-funded research is being blocked behind subscription, which is blocking access for innovators and, even barring scientists and academic institutions, so and so, from their own research findings. Now, this is where my sort of concern is that, that you may end up Because if you follow this logic to its sort of logical conclusion, particularly depending on how you define what is taxpayer funded research, if it's a direct grant from a government agency for a particular subject or for a particular area of research or a particular topic, is that how you're going to define it? Is it, like I said, subsidies of some form which is taxpayer funded? Then, you may end up actually doing the exact opposite, while also telling researchers that, look, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, a lot of research is also driven by, personal ambition, right? Particularly if your innovation ecosystem is one in which you can commercialize your research, then it is driven by ambition. It is driven by all these things. My immediate thought was that, you might end up being in a situation where you might want to do good for society, but you might end up doing the exact opposite, right?
Right. I think so. And I know mostly about India. I think we are very clear cut in the way our funding is meted out for life sciences. Usually grants that are given for instance, and a lot of our research and development, particularly in the life sciences, is funded by the government. So I think we have a little more clarity on the kind of funding that comes through for research. I think for commercialization, they might treat it differently. I think academic papers is what the US White House otherwise talks about. Patents, I think, are still will only be open once the patent is accepted or is granted, right? So you still have to have that secrecy. But will it have an unintended consequences on decreasing or harming innovation? I really doubt it, because I think that's positive externalities of having all of that knowledge open, not having to pay $30 for an article, might be immense.
Yeah.
But that's just my conception.
No, fair enough. So from an Indian point of view, India has had this open access policy in place for quite some time, right? So in that sense, India can claim to be a pioneer in this, right? Yet from what I hear from, in our conversations and from what I read from your writing, India has not done well to implement this. What's the policy exactly, and where is this implementation not worked out? Could you tell us?
Right. So I don't think we are a pioneer, because the NIH did this in 2008. But yes, I think it's still a good sign that DBT and DST did put out a policy paper saying that we have to have open access, by which they again meant that there should be institutional repositories which are created where papers are deposited. But that obviously then shifts the burden onto the institution to create the repository and run the repository. And I think that messaging has not really gone through. So you would expect, for example, that when you are giving out a grant, when DST and DBT is giving out a grant, which there are various fellowships that they give out, they would be telling the recipients that, hey, look, we have this open access policy, so you will have to deposit your journal article somewhere or else. But that I have not seen at all. So I think the communication has just not gone through. The policy is out, but I don't think there has been any implementation. We did briefly, so you spoke about that European project, right? Project S or Plan S, which also was for an open access policy. They had a very different kind of idea. So they also did not want that 1-year embargo that the US originally had. And what the European funding agency said was, we will pay for all of the papers that are published using our money to be published in open access journals. So open access journals are journals where you don't have to pay a subscription fee to read the paper, but they usually have a slightly higher article processing fee, which is the fee that you pay to get your paper published. So Plan S had that idea that we will do all open access, and India had briefly considered joining Plan S before we decided not, that we probably, for a number of reasons that were not disclosed, we kind of withdrew from joining the Europeans in doing open access. But I think if we had done that, then probably we could have seen a slightly better implementation strategy put in for open access.
All right, that's interesting. So what can now so now that since the United States, which is, the leading country in terms of research right now, although China has sort of caught up, particularly in science and technology research, the United States still is a leader, but in many domains, the Chinese have caught up. Yet, because of the ecosystem that the United States harbors, there are going to be lots of downstream effects on, say, the publishing industry in India, particularly because the big journals are all Western.
Right.
So what are the sort of downstream effects of changes in EU policy and American policy on India?
Right. So I think a lot of us are waiting with bated breath on how the publishing houses respond to this, because I think when India did this in 2015, even though we hadn't implemented it, I don't think there was a lot of noise that was made. But with the US being the biggest science funder, at least I think the journals will now have to respond in some manner. From the couple of publishing houses that have commented, we understand that they think it is too early to actually see how the policy is implemented, and then they'll take a call on what's to be done. The immediate kind of reaction was that, hey, we hope that you will also support us by increasing the funding that is given to research, because we will now probably have to move to more open access. I think that is the biggest fear that I think Indian scientists will also have, because if more and more of the, especially higher impact factor journals, move to open access a model, which means that there will be a higher article processing charge, the requirement from Indian scientists also who will publish that might go up. We'll have to just see how that evolves. But given the fact that India is also aligned on having an open access policy, maybe it's just generally makes sense for India also to think on how we can use this window that the US has created by doing two things. Obviously, A, we need to increase funding. I mean, funding as far as science goes has been pathetic. So this really falls that we need to support our scientists. I mean, yeah, I think Indian government should, at least DPT or DST should at least put out a statement in the short term saying that we recognize that this is happening, that there might be an increase in cost for publishing, and that we will support our scientists for publishing or accessing papers as required. This was something that, communication seems to have been a major problem for a long time. A few months ago, there was a removal of an exemption on GST, for example, that research institutions in India enjoy. So while private companies pay 12 or 18% GST on products, a lot of research institutions pay only 5%. There's the DSR exemption that was removed at a very short notice and left a lot of scientists struggling because it wasn't covered for by an increase in funding. So I think these two back-to-back events really enjoying that BT and DST, or at least the Ministry of Science and Technology, come out with a statement on increasing science funding. And then obviously it also creates an exciting space for Indian publishers who can think of going open access, or we can increase our profile, because that's a space that we can actually help Indian scientists as well to publish better and help India's image in the global science forum.
So basically, in that sense, it can be a massive opportunity if we can find ways in which the state can support, but also the state can catalyze private sector funding for science and technology research in India, which has been a bugbear for many, many years. I mean, for the last, I don't know, since 1990s, we've heard this, right? 6 to 7% is spent, and much of that also comes from the state as opposed to the private sector. The private sector barely spends on R&D in India. And even at a commercial level, forget, academic papers, which may be sort of theoretical and adding to knowledge, which may eventually maybe have some sort of application use at the end of the day. But this can be an opportunity if you actually, if you sort of take the lead, take the opportunity right now and actually create a system of open source journals, you can actually do much more.
Yeah. And I mean, look, India, we don't even need to stop at thinking about conventional journals, right? One of the things that we were discussing yesterday was you can now put on a TV show and you can change it and just click a button and it will come in Marathi and Tamil and Telugu, etc. Why have we this big unmet need of having journals in various languages, rather than having the same article in various languages in India, so that it's open to a lot more scientists than the small group of people who speak English and sit in research institutions. Because it's knowledge is science. The more the merrier, right? So there's really amazing thing that I think publishing houses in India can do. Look at technology is improving. We have a lot more videos that are being made to disseminate science. So perhaps there's an opportunity for us to just rethink this entire publishing process in parallel to how we judge scientists and help Indian science in many, many ways than just thinking about impact factors.
My last question to you on this is, okay, we might want to see that, and we might want to have publishing houses, or, no longer it may be publishing houses, it may be a multimedia, whatever publishing house. How open, I'm just going back to this idea of, seeing your byline in a print newspaper and seeing in a print and seeing your byline on a website. There is this still different thing of, one enjoys seeing your byline in a paper. Like, similarly, scientists have a certain thing about, being published in certain places is much more valued than maybe creating content worth tens of thousands of hours, which may actually be 10 times more valuable to society. So how open would scientists be to a change like that? Or would there be a lot of resistance from the scientific community itself, research community itself?
Right. So I think there's two ways we can actually see this. A, I think that you anyways end up creating tens of thousands of hours content for that one piece of paper that comes out. So I remember in my master's thesis, I had done a few experiments, just purely scientific learning. I've done a few experiments, and I was very keen of adding them in my master's thesis. And my supervisor was like, Shambhavi, it's just nothing to do with the actual project that you have done. And I was like, no, but I've done the experiments. I really want to talk about them. And I added enthusiasm. And she was like, but it just makes no sense. And I was like, no, I must still put them in, and I put them in. I think the point of the story is that I think you come with that enthusiasm of wanting to share what you have done, right? Because you have put effort into doing it. The challenge is that over time you realize that is not what the publication actually requires, and then you end up so concentrating on publishing that I think, at least for me personally, it took out the fun in doing science, because I felt I was publishing it I was doing the science for publishing and not doing science for science. So I think for those people, this might actually be great, because then you can also share all of the other stuff. Actually, DBT had a policy for this as well, that all of their raw data should also come online within a year. So within a year of generating it. So I think that is there. I think the problem again goes back to linking journals to getting tenure, getting grants, etc. And unless that problem is fixed, simply saying that we'll have open access is not going to help. So I think this is a good opportunity for everyone to actually even think that whole tenuring and granting process. So I don't think funding agencies can just get away with saying that, hey, we'll fund open access and you're sorted. You also have to figure out our hiring.
All right. So with that, we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much, Shambhavi. This is a fascinating conversation. And I'm sure there are lots of people on social media who are likely to agree with what you've just said, because I can see a lot of academics in my Twitter feed who are very frustrated with the publishing ecosystem. And, there are these routine viral threads of deep frustration with journals. So I'm sure that's
it is such a broken system. And people say age, people impact factors. And particularly from an Indian perspective, it is really bad because we just haven't had the resources to kind of always publish in iron papers. So when we compare ourselves globally, we end up getting more frustrated. So I think this is a good opportunity for reviewing everything that we do.
Yeah, I can totally understand, man. Because if you remember the paper that Suyash and I recently published, it was written about 2.5 years ago. And it got, by the time we published about Xi Jinping's reforms, he's probably done 2 more sets of reforms. So, unfortunately. But with that, we're going to call it a day. Thanks so much, Shambhavi.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening, folks. If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.